Hello and welcome to AstroFic, your weekly dose of fun, relatable astrology content where we apply astrology to fictional characters to find out why they're like that. But first, let me explain how this works and who I am. Hey, I'm Celeste, and I've been studying astrology off and on for about 5 years now, but it's always been present in my life. Within the past couple of years, I began practicing the art of reading birth charts, and this podcast is just another tool for me to apply and familiarize myself with all that I've learned. However, this podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only. I will be explaining the astrology as I go, but I'll be explaining it as I understand it, and I am by no means an expert. Making this podcast is fun for me because I get to ramble about my favorite characters and astrology combined. And while I hope you learn something, you very well may not. Either way, the more you know about astrology, the more you'll enjoy this podcast. So I do encourage all my listeners to passively take in as much knowledge as they can. For this podcast, I will be using the whole sign house system because it is just a much more basic outline of the house system and fits better with the format of a podcast where I can't show you the physical birth chart. When it comes to what birth date I use for characters, I will use canon birth dates if they exist to make it more challenging for me to work with the characterization. But before we get started, let's take a little break for our advertisements. Hunger Games fans, rise up. We have been summoned from our 7-year slumber for yet another Hunger Games movie. When I first wrote this episode, Tom Blythe was the only cast member announced as young Coriolanus Snow. But since then, now that I'm recording, a very long time later, the entire cast of tributes and mentors has been announced, which is very exciting. Everybody looks amazing. I mean, headshots always look amazing. That's their job. So we're just going to acknowledge that and just say beautiful and move on. The book was amazing. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was amazing. It was an amazing read. I could barely put it down after I got a certain ways into it, and I just can't wait to see the adaptation. I have been with my finger on the pulse since the book was announced, waiting for a movie announcement because I knew it was only a matter of time. And after I read the book, I was like, they literally have to. I could watch a 5-season TV show adaptation of this book. It's so amazing. Anyways, I'm sure you're all wondering what character we'll be talking about today, so I'll stop gushing about Hunger Games. Obviously, I'm a Hunger Games girly. Huge fan since day one. But I mean, if you read the title, you'll know that today's episode is about Peeta if it weren't for the baby Mellark. Rest assured, though, I will talk about other Hunger Games characters at some point, but today is Peeta's time to shine. I just think he's such a well-written character, and that Josh Hutcherson genuinely did a good job at portraying him, so I'm just really excited about today's episode. As always, let's establish his big three first. There are no canon birthdays for Hunger Games characters because, it's post apocalyptic. So these placements are completely my own opinion. After much thought, I made Peeta a Taurus. Definitely a win for the Taurus community listening. We'll get into the depth of that placement relatively soon, but I think it's just so juicy and deep. And if you've been paying attention to the eclipse season we were just in and are still in, you might know what I'm talking about. Taurus is directly opposite Scorpio, making them sister signs, so they're very similar, but it's kind of a two sides of the same coin situation. Taurus can be just as manipulative and mysterious as Scorpio, they just do it differently. And yes, of course, the baby scene in Catching Fire was the deciding factor in this. Peeta's moon sign is in Capricorn. I know, kind of a rough placement for the sweet bread boy, but if you're a fan of the book series, not just the movies, you know that Peeta can be just as ruthless as any other tribute. I mean, he helped bail Katniss out of a few situations early on. He learned how to play all the aspects of the games very quickly because he knew he didn't stand out as a winning tribute to sponsors right off the bat. But I digress. The reason I gave him a Capricorn moon is because of his relationship with his mother. The moon represents the mother, and the audience is made aware of the fact that Peeta does not get along with either of his parents. In fact, they're pretty much killed off with little consequence in Mockingjay. I feel that a Capricorn moon pretty accurately represents the disconnect, abuse, and neglect Peeta suffered at the hands of his mother. Both his mother and his father were more concerned with their poverty and trying to get out of it than raising a child. It seemed like having a child was more of a punishment than a blessing, and Peeta was just somebody to help with the chores, and it didn't go much farther than that. I know, it sucks and it's sad. I think I mentioned on Patreon that his chart was probably going to be rather tragic. His rising sign isn't tragic, but depending on how you feel about a certain mutable water sign, it might be tragic to you. If you're familiar with the modalities and elements of each sign, then I've already given it away, but Peeta's rising sign is in Pisces. While this placement compared right next to his Capricorn moon can seem sad or unfortunate, I actually think it's a sign of resilience in a way. Often, the way we experience emotions or the moon is just learned behavior from childhood. Like if you were told that emotions were useless, that would be represented in your chart via your moon sign or the fourth house or the IC, depending on your chart makeup. But while our reactions to emotions are oftentimes learned, the sense of self is entirely our own making. Peeta was beaten down and ignored his whole life, and suddenly the end was in front of him in the form of the fucking Hunger Games. Yet somehow he still held on to hope that maybe there was a way out of it. I mean, he didn't have that hope at first, but he always returned to the small fragment that he held. That's very Piscean to me. The world tried very hard to beat the hope out of him, and still he dreamt of a better world. His faith was shaken, don't get me wrong, but somehow against all odds, he continued to live. I think the rest of his chart also has a hand in how he was able to do this, but I interpret his Pisces rising as being the core of that hopeful ideal. Pisces is the ruler of the 12th house. It's so otherworldly, ethereal, and dreamy. Just all the things you'd expect of dreams. But this can also include the darker dreams, the nightmares. Pisces can get so far from reality that they walk straight into the darkest, worst case scenarios. And when stuff gets really hard, especially when Pete is brainwashed in Mockingjay, he does go down that dark path. I think the game he and Katniss come up with, real or not real, encapsulate this Pisces rising very well. However, he doesn't have any planets in Pisces, so there's nothing in the skies directly affecting this hopeful idealist persona. It's mostly the earthly environment he's surrounded by. I mean, even Katniss gets pissed off at Peeta for acting like things were going to be fine or that they had a shot at living. Maybe she just gets angry at him for having hope in hopeless situations, but does she ever thank him for keeping hope because his hope made her have a strong enough sense of hope and faith in Mockingjay that she was able to end the war despite Peeta being brainwashed and not there to help her? If it's not clear, I'm a pretty diehard supporter of Katniss and Peeta. I definitely think they needed each other, especially in the end, because by the end they were trauma bonded with each other. A core trait of Peeta's, and like I said, it's the core of his Pisces rising, is that idealistic sense of hope. Okay, I think that was the most I've ever talked about Pisces on this podcast, and it was a lot. Let's all take a deep breath, ground for a second, take a drink of water, whatever you need. And we're skipping over the second house in Aries and headed straight to the third house in Taurus. See? I told you we'd be talking about that Taurus sun soon. I've given Peeta 3 Taurus placements. Ooh, 3 placements in the third house. Note that synchronicity. Okay, so he has 3 placements here. Obviously, his sun sign is 1, then we've got a planet and an asteroid. So let's set the scene. The third house is the house of communication and the mind. It has a strong connection with the sign Gemini and the planet Mercury. The third house also rules over short distance travel, your immediate environment, people close to you like neighbors and siblings, and has an influence over your behaviors, habits, and thought patterns, hence it being the house of communication and the mind. With the sun here, Peeta really prides himself on his communication skills, and he's perfected his charisma skills over the years because once he got to talking, people were more inclined to include him in things and think about him. But he's not very good at actually initiating the conversations. It's not smooth or suave, and usually he waits for other people to come up to him. I think that's the Taurus influence. Taurus gets very good at what they do, but they're not a fan of doing it off the clock. If Peeta's not actively engaged in a social situation, he can do or say embarrassing things. But the capital people never see this because Peeta is always on for the games and sponsors. Taurus knows when to engage and disengage from situations as well. Okay, I kind of feel like I'm talking in circles, so let's move on to the planet that's present, Venus. That's right, Peeta's got a Taurus Venus. I truly think Taurus Venus is the pinnacle of all Venus signs, but maybe it's because I have a Libra Venus and both signs are ruled by Venus. I think Peeta is a very good communicator with Katniss. Sure, they both lie and they have arguments, but that's normal. In general, they always make up and they do stop lying to each other and eventually can only trust each other. That's true Taurus love, baby. Before he was brainwashed, Peeta generally doesn't question Katniss's decisions. The Venusian influence in the third house also contributes to his charismatic capabilities. His words can, quite literally, be very seductive. I mean, Joanna Mason does remark that Peeta was becoming a new sexualized tribute icon after he and Katniss won. Part of that remark was to slight Katniss, but she wouldn't have lied about that because of the serious implications that can have with traumatizing tributes after their games, like we see with Finnick Odair. Hunger Games is so complex. I love it. Also, can we talk about Taurus Venus Peeta wanting nothing more than to take care of Katniss? That's what a Taurus Venus does. Peeta loves the fact that they can live in a sort of luxurious state after the games with their winnings because it just makes it even easier for him to take care of himself so he can, in turn, take care of Katniss. They take care of each other, and that is such love. Oh my god. Okay, the last placement in this house isn't as nice as the Sun and Venus. Peeta has the asteroid Chiron present in his Taurus third house. Chiron is known as the wounded healer. It represents some place you've been hurt before, so you go out of your way to help others and prevent them from feeling the same hurt you have. Or, maybe you don't go out of your way. That's not necessarily what happens with Chiron. Sometimes you attract people who have a similar wound. But for Peeta, it's clear he's been wounded by other people's words before, or perhaps the lack of communication from others. It's probably been both, but a moment that specifically sticks out to me as being particularly wounding is when we find out that his charismatic personality made President Coin want to take him to be the leader of the rebels rather than Katniss. That fact alone isn't particularly wounding, but it's because of that thought process that Peeta ends up in the hands of President Snow to be tortured and brainwashed to begin with. Peeta had very strong feelings on brainwashing, torture, and really all aspects of the war after that due to how deeply it affected him. He was a full prisoner of war. Before he was captured, it seemed he probably would have rather stayed out of it, but then it directly harmed him in a much more intimate way than the games did. For the games, he had kind of a hands off part in that. But aside from that, like I said, there were many instances in which people deliberately tried to hurt Peeta's feelings and use his words against him, which could be the main way that his Chiron and third house manifests, or that is also how it could have manifested. I think one healing instance, or rather a bonding experience between two people who may have a similar Chiron placement, is when Joanna Mason sees, or rather meets, Peeta and Katniss in the elevator and Haymitch for like the first time, and she like completely undresses in front of them. Y'all know the scene. And she tells Peeta and Katniss, well, she's talking to Peeta as we find out, but she tells Peeta like that he's like a sex symbol or whatever, and Katniss thinks that Joanna is talking to her and says something, and Joanna's like, I wasn't talking to you. The way that people talk about third house Chiron placements, I feel like, is a major influence in some way in how this placement can manifest. Moving on to the fourth house in Gemini, where there is only one placement, I'm pretty sure I talked kind of extensively about the duality of Gemini in Steve Harrington's episode, so if you want to hear the whole spiel, go listen to that. But the incredibly condensed version is that Gemini gets a bad rap because of its essence of duality. The idea of duality really applies here to Peeta's fourth house in Gemini. The fourth house is a house of home, foundation, and family, as well as how one acts at home, how they take care of their space, and how private they keep their private life. Peeta is a pretty private person we see as the audience, but he carefully selects what he can share to make it seem like he's an open book and sharing his whole life with people. It's something that Gemini and Scorpio specifically are very good at doing, making themselves seem very open whilst withholding a lot of information still, so they're like very mysterious. The difference is though that Scorpio doesn't hide the mysteriousness. In fact, they fan the flames of that. It's part of their allure. With Gemini, they're so bright and bubbly and all over the place that they're, whether intentionally or not, they are distracting from their mystery around how they're responding to your questions and what questions they're dodging and stuff. They're very charming for sure. But this in turn makes people think he's stupid for sharing all this information in a setting such as Panem. But he's not. That's another thing Gemini is good at. I feel that they're very good at playing the fool when they're not. It's very Shakespearean, to be honest, and Shakespeare is very mercurial, so it comes full circle. Anyways, Peeta has a single planet in his Gemini fourth house, which is the planet Jupiter. Jupiter is the planet of expansion and luck, often said to have a Midas touch to it. I think this influence has allowed Peeta to perfect the art of having a very private life and an exaggerated public life. Technically, Jupiter is in detriment in Gemini, but I think that just means that there was a period of time where Peeta's strategy maybe didn't work, it didn't fulfill him, and maybe this is like a cycle that can repeat. I think, though, that this applies more to his school age before the reaping. It seems that many children of District 12 are pretty wary and untrusting of each other, which didn't help Peeta or any of them really in their growth with communication and in social situations. But it is what it is. Peeta eventually masters the skill of duality, and that's what matters. I think he'd make a terrifyingly good influencer in the modern age, to be honest. And that's Jupiter, baby. The fifth house is kind of like the house of finding joy in the little things. That's the most succinct way to describe it to me. Peeta only has one placement in this house, his Mars sign. Unfortunately, Mars is in fall in Cancer, so it's definitely not the easiest Mars sign to work with. I think he had to learn very early in life how to find the small wonders and relish them. That's why he was so good at decorating cakes and doing the camouflage. It was a task that his parents probably didn't want to do, but Peeta enjoyed it and did it well. I associate Cancer with food in general, but especially sweets and little treats, so that's why the cake thing comes to mind so quickly. With Mars in the fifth house, Peeta is more motivated to do things of a creative nature, and in Cancer, that means he probably has more of a need for rest than others. I think it's pretty well known that he is very creative, and his creations often serve a purpose deeper than what most people perceive. Like in Catching Fire, when he goes in for evaluations and all he does is paint a giant portrait of Rue on the floor. That is a beautiful display of his Cancer Mars in fifth house. I can't talk too much about that portrait of Rue or I'll cry though, so let's move on. Mars is also your anger, and the way that Peeta expresses his anger can seem so volatile, but to an astrologer, it probably just reads as watery. You know, you can obviously, I'm not certified or well trained in any manner of speaking. So if you do not agree with my headcanon placements, then of course that is totally your right. And I'll probably agree with whatever you say because it's just so subjective. But the way that PETA expresses anger specifically is very Cancer Mars to me as well. He is usually calm and quiet, borderline crying a lot of the times in conflict scenes we see. He's welling up when confronted with conflict. But when he's truly angry, there are no tears. And that's what's, like, really scary about Cancer Mars is, like, usually in conflict, they're crying, but when they're not crying, you know it's gonna get bad really quickly. Cancer Mars feels like the type to be throwing chairs. I don't know. Let's go with Neptune next. Neptune is the planet of imagination, delusion, spirituality, and the light. Neptune typically has a pretty watery disposition, but according to some astrological authors, Neptune is in exaltation in Leo or Cancer. But it's here, so we're going to go with the exaltation in Leo thing just to talk about it. So, I talked earlier about how Peeta found ways to make his daily life bearable, and I think the energy needed to do that in a place like District 12 is definitely Neptunian. It's the planet of delusion after all. Peeta by no means sugarcoats what they lived like in District 12, but he also wasn't from a really impoverished family like Katniss was, so he had a little more leeway with his positive thinking. But even in the games, Peeta thinks he's going to die. He doesn't put a lot of emphasis on a completely unobtainable goal. He does try to enjoy the time he has, though. The sixth house of daily routines combined with Leo Neptune gives him this outlook of trying to live presently and enjoy the moment because it could all be gone tomorrow. Man, I don't remember who I was talking to while creating the concept for this episode, but I told someone that Peeta's chart can appear pretty nice, but when you delve deeper, it's just like bathed in tragedy. But hey, at least Peeta doesn't have any 8th house or 12th house placements. Anyways, the last placement in the 6th house is his north node in Leo. The best way I can summarize this placement is like at the end of the entire series, the epilogue where Peeta and Katniss are older and have kids. In that epilogue, the way Peeta shines in Katniss's eyes, the way he is so playful and loving to their children, that is what Peeta was destined to do. Maybe Katniss's chart shows she was destined to be the figurehead for a rebellion and take out the powers that be, but for Peeta, his destiny was to live through that, to take care of Katniss, and to help rebuild life better after the rebellion for his children. And I think that's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing to dedicate yourself to. I mean, he clearly enjoyed it, or at least he enjoyed it in Katniss's perspective, which is good enough because they are extremely trauma bonded. So, like I said earlier, Peeta doesn't have any placements in the 8th house. So let's just skip ahead to the 9th house in Scorpio. He only has one placement present here, his Uranus. Uranus is in exaltation in Scorpio because Uranus is about groundbreaking change that can perhaps feel rather sudden, and maybe the change that happens isn't as clean of a break and gradual change as it could be. But Peeta has it in the 9th house of philosophy, worldview, hypothesis of life, and just like one's general perception of the world around them and the perception of some of the larger institutions that like make up the world. In Scorpio, these perceptors are kind of under a consistent state of change. Not only that, but again, Peeta was literally brainwashed to believe and trust in the powers of the state when that was not true previously. That screams Uranus and ninth house Scorpio to me. And I mean, eventually his views change the nation they live in. His belief that there can always be a better version of life to live is partially what fuels his personal rebellion against the Capitol, and is probably one of the reasons why President Coin wanted Peeta to be the face of the rebellion instead of Katniss. All right, second to last house was only one placement. Peeta has his 10th house in Sagittarius with his Pluto present. Pluto is the more long term kind of expected change that opposes Uranus, where Uranus is more chaotic, Pluto is much more methodical. And in the 10th house of like social perception or how one is perceived by others, Pluto adds very opposing viewpoints. I think one of the ways this manifests, to talk more about how Peeta as a character was received, his audience reception from what I remember wasn't bad, but it was pretty opposed. Not near as bad as Edward versus Jacob, but there were Gale girlies and there were Peeta stands, and you were either one or the other. Personally, I started as a Gale girly because I'm kind of a sucker for childhood friends to lovers story, but I'm literally celestial, of course. The star-crossed lover shtick got me eventually, and I mean, we see pretty early on that Peeta truly cares for Katniss, both as she is and as the person she wants to be. Gale could only love and care for one version of Katniss, and it turned out to be a version that he created in his head. Funny how men do that. Anyways, Peeta really won me over in Catching Fire. By the end of the first book, I wasn't quite as gung ho about Gale, but still would have picked him over Peeta. That is completely flipped now, though, and I think that's a more common experience than I thought it was at the time. This kind of perception of Peeta can be seen in the books too, though. For the most part, no one really cared about Peeta during their first games until the romance with Katniss started. And I don't mean when he acted and pretended during their interviews. You can say that he really did have a crush on Katniss for their whole childhood, but I'm still not entirely convinced of that even now, over a decade later. Either way, though, when she saves him during the games, that's when their romance really starts in my eyes, even if they're both just doing it for the cameras, for the sponsors, and gifts of medicine. Acting's acting, I know. But if you're not a trained actor by trade, I think there's a higher chance for you to catch feelings for an acting partner than professionals. Anyways, Peeta kind of slides under the radar for the most part, but once he catches your attention, he never leaves your brain. And that is his 10th house Sagittarius with Pluto, for sure. Finally, we've reached Peeta's final house, the 11th house. I think this is the first time I've created a birth chart without any 12th house placements. At least at the time of writing, it is, and since I'm writing the episodes out of order, that could be completely false now when this is published. But we'll see. Anyways, his 11th house is in Capricorn and he has two placements. If you can recall from the beginning of the episode, I gave Peeta a Capricorn moon. Actually, on the day of writing this, I came across a TikTok about some of the moon signs, and just to provide full context, I'm going to include the one they said before Capricorn, but the person in the video was like, "To all Aquarius moons," which is my personal placement, "I'm sorry about your mom. To all Capricorn moons, I'm sorry about your dad." And it just made me laugh really hard because I was taking a break from writing this episode and couldn't wait to include it. But yeah, that kind of summarizes his Cap moon. Sorry about your dad, Peeta. And that sounds like they passed, but really it's just like sorry that they were the way that they are. The 11th house is pretty similar to the ninth house in that it's about like the greater world, but the 11th house focuses more on the social aspect of life. So it rules over large social groups and gatherings, clubs, organizations, stuff of that nature. I think with his moon in this house, he really longs and yearns for a rich social life, but he frankly just doesn't get to have it. He tries to establish relationships with other tributes with Katniss, but I think Capricorn has a natural distrust of everyone around them except for the chosen few that have earned their trust. So for Peeta, that's just mostly Katniss, but you could probably throw Haymitch and Effie in there as well, and eventually Prim. Many people seem to be under the impression that Peeta was naive and trusting of everyone, but I see him as very much the opposite. He's just good at making you think he trusts you. He has mastered the art of remaining a private person while seeming like an open book, which I know we went over in the fourth house. So I think this placement, or this entire house rather, just reaffirms that. I say that especially because Peeta also has his Lilith placement here in the 11th house Capricorn. Lilith is supposed to be our dark or shadow side and all that. I've started to think of it as our unhealthy coping mechanisms because modern astrology, which is what I practice, has a psychological backdrop to it. Anyways, that Lilith really contributes to his distrust of others, I think. He's probably very capable of seeing the worst in people, and ignoring that has been an active choice he makes with everyone he meets. But the Capitol exploits that when they hijack him, and instead of him ignoring all the flaws and drawbacks of the people he cares for, it's all he can focus on. Of course, the primary focus being on how awful they perceive Katniss to be. Obviously, this fucks him and his brain up for a very long time. Damn, I'm sorry, guys. I guess I just can't find a way to end this episode on a happy, uplifting note when we're talking about Lilith. Go back and listen to his Leo 6 house if you want to end it on a happy note. I'm so sorry. Anyways, that's all I have for Peeta Mellark. Please leave a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed this episode. And don't forget to share it with your friends. Post it to your fan groups if you want. I'd love to hear feedback or your take on the character. Follow me on TikTok or Twitter and let me know what you think as well. And if you are being super kind and leaving a rating or review and you want to leave a suggestion or two of a character that I could possibly do, please do. Please. I'm starting a list. I'm starting a very long list. um just some housekeeping. I am recording this in kind of an all-nighter recording spree. Um, because I am moving and I am starting college again soon, which is kind of why I fell off the face of the earth for a little bit. I was working a lot and making money, so I could afford this move. I will be making some changes to the things that I am doing. I will be closing my Patreon because that just has a lot of upkeep. However, instead, I will be making my tarot readings pay what you want, meaning absolutely anything or literally nothing. I don't care. I am going to create a Google form. It may be included in the show notes at the time of publishing. It may not. It just depends on what I do. But I will there will eventually be a Google form that people can fill out, and I will send them a PDF of the reading or whatever episodes will probably no longer have a schedule. I don't know how hard it will be for me to return to college, so just don't have any expectations and you'll be very happy with the results, I think, is probably the most advisable course of action. I have a lot of ideas. It's just a matter of whether I have the time and energy to get to them or not. Thank you for listening. AstroFic is currently been listened to in I think 16 different countries now, which is absolutely wild to me. Our demographic is insane, spans all ages, and that's just amazing. Everything is amazing. Thank you guys so much for listening. I enjoy doing this podcast a lot, and I apologize for my now sporadic uploading, but I hope you enjoy what I come out with, and I hope you can return to episodes as you please. I hope that's like fun for you. Okay. Thank you. Leave a rating or review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and leave a suggestion for a character for me to do in your review. My name is Celeste, and you've been listening to AstroFic. Tune in next time to find out why our favorite characters are like that. Bye.